Well, I got one of these pullers from the Farmer Tech folks, and I used it in one of my prior videos and realized that I really didn't do it justice, because there's just a lot of other things about that particular tool that you sort of have to understand where it fits into the matrix of chainsaw life. So what I have here is a couple of the pullers that I've used on the channel over the years, and you might remember these, you might not. When I was working on the 562s, the Ultimate Old Man saw, in that class of machine, I used this to split cases. I had one, I think I call it cracking eggs. And this particular puller was designed specifically for the 555 and the 562 class saws to work both the PTO side and the flywheel side, to push the crank through the cases in order to split the cases. And the reason why it had such a sophisticated puller setup, I mean, this thing here gets assembled, is pretty complex, is because the crankshaft on those are stuffer cranks. And I mentioned that. I think I've got a crankshaft around here. So the case splitting tool that I would like to use, and used early on in the channel, I can't use on a 562 just simply because it can't span those stuffers, right? I don't know if I was making the distinction as I was going through these different saws, why you had to have specialized tools, one versus the next. And like I said, this one here was for the 555, 562 class of auto-tuned Husqvarnas that have the stuffer cranks, right? Of course, you could use them on the non-stuffer cranks. It's just they're a pretty complex device. If you want to see how these are used, you're going to have to go back to that video, right? So let me put this away. So that's an example of a fairly complex pulling tool, right? And the only thing this can do is effectively latch onto a case and push the crankshaft through the case, hence case splitters. If you push that crankshaft through while you're pulling the case, you pull the case half off the crank. That's what this is designed to do, both on the PTO and flywheel side. Specialized tool, Husqvarna. Same basic deal, except for this is for the 576 and the 575 class of saw. And this is a Husqvarna unique puller for that particular saw. Again, it would latch onto bar studs and push the crank through the case or pull the case, depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist. Pretty expensive tool, pretty specialized, and yet again the reason why this kind of case splitting tool has to be used is because the cranks on those saws are stuffer cranks, kind of like this one. And to put those saws back together, well, I get ahead of myself. And of course, in the Husqvarna world, this is the case splitting tool, which jams the crankshaft through the case again to pull the case apart. And this is for non-stuffer cranks. And I showed that because this can, well, this can span the crank, and basically it pushes on the inside of the bearings and pushes the crank shaft through the bearings. So those three tools, this one and the two I just showed for the 576 and the 562, are Husqvarna unique to that world case splitting tools. And of course you've got all these, and I've got one in every thread that Husqvarna has ever made. And all the different saws they made these for, these pullers. And this is to assemble the cases. So instead of pushing the crank through the bearing, it pulls them through that bearing so you can pull the cases together. And I've showed these for years. This is what I've used for a very, very long time. And from time to time I'll still use those. And I came up with these as an evolution to the Husqvarna tools. So instead of having a wrench on those little tools, I wanted a little distance away from the case to make it easier to work. And I have a handle directly attached to the jack just to make it easier for myself. And I've demonstrated this many times. These are really just a modification of the Husqvarna tools. That's all it is. Instead of having a wrench, it has a handle. And instead of being short, I made them longer to give me some space. And I also came up with bushings for specific applications. And I crossed over into the Stihl world with this set of tools when I started making tools to assemble these big 660s. Because the Stihl tools that I saw were like hyper expensive and they just looked really complex. So I adapted the Husqvarna style pullers to assemble the cases and the big C-clamp to pull them apart to work on the big 660s because they have a crank like this with no stuffers. I hope you're following all this. So this is basically just these are just an evolution of the Husqvarna style tools that I make for myself to make my life easier. Now, flywheel pullers. I've used this. I've had this literally since I was a preteen and worked on everything from motorcycles to lawnmowers and stuff like that. And this was actually a gear puller. It wasn't for flywheels. And it spent more time pulling primary gears than anything else. But it just happens to span the chainsaw flywheels, so I've adapted this to the chainsaw world, and I've used it for quite a few because for the most part, you know, it gets around that thing's got sprung. It gets right around the flywheel, and you know, you'll pull it right off the crankshaft. And you've seen me use this on a bunch of saws over the years. Basically, just give a little tension and a tap, and the flywheel is flexed a little bit, and pops right off. Done it for decades. And of course, I've got a gazillion of this style too for pulling flywheels. This is actually fairly common in the Stihl world. So now I get into the Stihl world with these and built my own tools, so I don't need any more pullers. I mean, I've got both the assembly tools and the case splitting tools modified based on the Husqvarna pattern to work on these 660s and smaller Stihls like this one over here. So why am I going there? Well, because this showed up, and I was asked politely to show people how to use this thing. And, you know, I thought it was pretty obvious at first, and I started looking around and realizing that no, nobody has ever really shown, other than how to split a case, what this set of tools is all about. That Stihl mechanic world is really kind of tight with their information. So what this video is a little closer look at this particular puller case assembly tool, case disassembly tool combination. And it's really just one half of a set of tools. This here is just one half. Because the Stihl shop people will have this for the PTO side, and then they'll have this big disc with a whole bunch of holes that has the same style of operation for the flywheel side, both to push the crankshaft through on disassembly as a splitter, but then as a puller to pull the crankshaft back through the bearing. The thing I find funny about all this is, just as an aside, I remember one of the online experts was all bent out of shape because we were using a press at the time, or heat, whatever it was, and we were pushing on the case versus the bearing. Well, every Stihl tool for pulling the crank through the bearing is attached to the case, does not push on the inner race of that bearing. So obviously for decades, Stihls have been assembled in shops with tools that actually pull from the case, are attached to the case and pull the crankshaft through the bearing. So those bearing pockets are obviously strong enough, and the cases are obviously strong enough. So that whole line of argument to justify a specific type of tooling is bullshit. I'm sorry, is BS. I do that, and I also promote the idea of pulling on the inner race, mainly because the Husqvarna tools that I have do that, and then the tools that I built for my own shop, the Hilltop Saw Shop pullers, are all designed to either push on a larger surface area of the case as close to the bearing as possible. Usually, I'm trying to get to the case where it's in between the bearing race and the puller. And that's what this whole thing's about. You know, when you use my pullers, is I set that right there, and it's actually setting on this inner here, so you're squeezing the bearing into it. Less chance of cracking the case. So I kind of went, over-engineered that, because trust me, the Stihl tool to pull that crank through that case is not nearly as robust. So another story, another deal. Back to this. I'll start the whole discussion by saying I think this is actually a worthwhile tool to have. In my shop, what it's going to be is that catch-all, because you just saw part of the array of the pullers I have. It's not everything, but it's mostly what I have. But there's always some saw that'll come through, or some piece of equipment that'll come through that I don't have a puller for. Enter this, because I really think, and I use this on a 372, and I think it'll work on most of the Husqvarna saws, just because you have all those different spacings, right? They're just drilled the hell out of that thing. So it's, it's kind of a universal tool, and the unique thing about this particular set of tools, whether it's the Stihl shop tools, the ones from Holzfforma, FarmerTech, Huds, or whatever you want to call those folks over there, is this is not just a case splitter, but it's also an assembly tool. And as I said before, it's only one half the tool set, because there's another set that you get on that does the same kind of thing, attaching to the holes on the case on the flywheel side. It's a circle. It's basically a disc with a whole bunch of holes that'll line up with the holes on the case to fasten it to the case, and then does the same kind of puller. I don't have one, so I can't show it to you. I don't need one, but I might just find one just to complete the circle on this particular shop tool. And again, I'm going to say that at the price point this thing is, it's worth having. All right. So now that I've gone around the circle, how does this damn thing work? Well, to split the cases, obviously you start like I did by pulling the 6 case screws out. And I want to point out, this is a FarmerTech set of cases. This is from one of the saws that came apart with that, well, I guess I just have to say it. It was a Cross Performance top end, and it ate the rod bearing, because when I started miking and measuring, I found out that the actual bore alignment was out of alignment and just stressed the heck out of this thing, and eventually made it fail. So that is one of those cases. I understand that's an anomaly, but I want to point out that on those FarmerTech cases, they have that anti-lock goo right there, that blue stuff, which makes it pretty hard to get those screws out of there. That's the good news. Well, that's the bad news, because it's hard to get them out. You got to use a tool like this to get the leverage, right? But the good news is that they're not going to rattle out. Once that case is together, I have yet to have any problems with the integrity of the cases coming apart or leaking or anything like that. The cases and the case screws that I got from those aftermarket purveyors of parts have been really, really good. And this case here is a case in point, no pun intended. It's a very nice casting. And I'm actually going to put this back together. I think this is worth salvaging, this set of cases. So it's not going to be a high priority, but it certainly is something I want to do. So running this tool on this set of cases moves that along incrementally, right? So to pull this apart, you got to have this backed out, because basically the tip of this is going to get into that dimple on the crankshaft. Then you set it right down here. You got to make sure that you have the chain adjuster back. And since this is basically a copy of the Stihl shop tool, and because Stihl understands their saws, they basically machine the shape right here to clear the chain adjuster, because being shop-oriented people, they didn't want to add complexity to the use of the tool. So why would you have to pull the chain adjuster apart if you don't have to? You know what I'm saying? So it's just clever. So where was I? Oh yeah. So basically you set this down on the cases, on the bar screws, and it's relieved underneath to fit the Stihl unique bar studs. And they've machined this area here away so it'll clear your bar adjustment, right? And then basically you wind it down and there it goes. Give it a little bit of a tap, it'll persuade it. And there it comes, it's beginning to come apart. There. How's that? And that is one of the detractions of this style, because intrinsically it's going to build a torque around that case. It's going to try to rotate about those two bar studs, so you might have to do a little bit of extracurricular tapping like I just did, right? And then once it's free of that locating pin, it'll come right out. So there you go. What I'm going to do here is just go right back into the flip side of that and show you how this pulls cases together. And I'm going to have to pull this apart to assemble. This reminds me of that Paul Harvey radio show where now you're going to get the rest of the story on this puller. You know what I'm saying? So that's how you push the PTO side apart using this particular case splitter. That's patterned after a Stihl shop tool. Okay? And again, I said it before, but I'm going to repeat myself, is there's another tool for this side that Stihl offers that's a big disc with a bunch of screw holes that attaches to the case, you know, to all those, probably these in here would be my guess. And then it has the same kind of a jack screw which pushes that crank out, right? I wonder if I should just push that crank out of there. What I did on mine is I spread these just a little bit on my Husqvarna version so it would span the 660 cranks. That bearing is fine. Look at that. I don't know that bearing. You know, I'm going to leave this apart because I want to show how you pull the crank through the case here. I'm going to reuse these cases. You're just going to have to bear with me here and imagine that this crankshaft is stuck in the other side of the case. I just pulled it out. I probably should have left it together for the demonstration. But this tool is a dual purpose tool. Both pushes the crank through, but it also pulls it back through the bearing as an assembly tool. And that's what all these things are about right here. And it's not readily obvious unless you've seen these things before on how this is going to work. You've got this goofy thing right here. And it threads in to this. It's a reverse thread. Okay? See how that goes on there? It's a reverse thread. So just think about that for a second. And these thread onto the crank. You got to get the right one for the crank, and they've got them for the different saws. So this would be obviously for that saw. Bring it all the way down. You're going to have to use a little bit of imagination here, but basically what's happening is I've threaded that to the end of the crankshaft, that piece. These have to go back on here just like we had before. But typical engineering from a company like Stihl, it's a very clever design, and it takes a little bit of mechanical knowledge to actually put this thing to use. Now, this is where it gets interesting. I've got that threaded on the crank. Let the crank turn and then back that thing out. Let the crank just turn. Now there's a couple of reasons why that is really, really, really good. One of the issues that you've seen with the straight pull type tools, even the ones that I build, is if you pull the crank right through the seal, right, sometimes it'll prolapse the seal. And that's been kind of a problem that guys have dealt with. And my solution was to stop every once in a while and go in there and turn the crank as it's going through the seal. But with this particular tool, guess what? The crank is turning. Now, if you're on the other side, you've got to manage the connecting rod so it doesn't get, you know, it doesn't get in on the case right there and jam up. So you'd have to have one hand holding the connecting rod and keeping it, you know, from jamming into the case. But you see how this is operating? It's now pulling the crank back through the case that I just finished using that tool to push the crank through. And it does a stellar job of that because it does turn that crank. Okay? So now I've got that crank pulled back through, and again, Stihl offers the same style of tool that goes to the flywheel side. I'm not sure that the Farmer Tech people have figured that out yet. So once you've got that crank in there, let's say it's now it's pulled nice and tight. Now you have to disassemble this thing, right? And you got to use a little common sense, because what's going to happen? It's going to go right back to being a splitter and push that crank right through the bearing or through the case if you don't take these bar nuts off, right? And once they're off, then you can do this and basically disassemble the tool off the saw. There you go. And then of course this is reverse thread, and there it goes. Now you tell me if that isn't just freaking cool. So what they're offering with this tool is both a case splitter, which pushes the crank through the bearing, and a case assembly tool for the PTO side of the saw. And if you buy the Stihl set, you'll have the other half of the equation for the flywheel side. Now I don't know if Farmer Tech's coming out with that or not, but I hope they do. A Stihl shop tool is going to cost you like $300. I don't know what these cost. I didn't buy this one. It's on indefinite loan, but I think it's really handy, and it obviously works. And for the people who are doing the kit saws, having that as a tool, especially for pulling the crank through the seals, because the seals come installed in the cases, because that tool turns the crank as it's pulling it through the seal, that gives a less experienced person a better chance of not prolapsing the seal, which is a gain. And yeah, it's a little complex. This is a win, a big win. You know, the quality is, it's okay. But just like this other tool that I've used for a long time from them, they did this pretty early on. It may not be as good as my Husqvarna shop tool version of this, but I've done dozens of cases, and there it is. It still works fine. So it's good enough to do the job. And I think this is going to fall into the same category, especially you guys who are doing kit saws. You know, this, you might end up having to buy my tools for the flywheel side, or use a press or a variety of other tools. But this gets the PTO side both pushing and pulling, both coming and going. Absolute win. And what these are the attachment tools to pull cranks for other saws that have different threads on the crankshafts. And I don't know if it crosses into the Husqvarna world or not. I honestly don't know. But I mean, I've got a bunch of cranks around. Maybe we can see whether or not, you know, they fit the other cranks. So these are big enough for Husqvarna. I wonder if they fit the Husky cranks. They look like they're a finer thread, though. That's the problem. See? I don't think they do. It's Stihl. I think these are... The Huskies are a little coarser thread on the clutch. But basically what these are, probably for other Stihl models, you know, I think it's a Stihl-oriented tool, are the adapters to allow you to pull the different size cranks through the different Stihl cases. So I hope that clears things up. And I think this is definitely a win. This tool right here is a definite win. Like I said, I use it on a 372 to split those cases. So yeah, it crosses over. Just like the Husqvarna tools have crossed over into the Stihl world, in my shop, the Stihl style tools can cross over into the Husqvarna world as well, as witness of the last video I just uploaded. So anyway, it's cold. I'm going inside. Talk to you later. Bye for now.